Hello, this is Elizabeth Chu, the CEO of the South Carolina Historical Society. Welcome to From the Vault, the South Carolina Historical Society podcast, created and hosted by my colleague Sydney Derrick, our librarian. This podcast will demystify archives. I am passionate about convincing people that archives are not in any way boring. They are, in fact, incredibly interesting. Who doesn't like to read stories about other people? Imagine spending all day long in a library reading someone else's diary. That is what historians and people who use archives do every day. From the Vault, we'll be telling stories of all South Carolinians from the perspective of the many fascinating items in our large and important archival collections.
Hello and welcome to the podcast. As you just heard from Elizabeth, I'm Sydney Derrick, librarian here at the South Carolina Historical Society. In this episode, we're continuing our series on South Carolina's 4th Regiment during the Revolutionary War. We're exploring their order book, which is basically just a journal of the orders they received and their activities. But first, let's talk about the news and announcements from the Historical Society. We have a new tour happening in our museum. Fridays at 2 p.m., you can join our education coordinator, Melina Teston, for a special 45-minute guided tour of the historic Fireproof Building. Walk in the footsteps of Robert Mills, a Charleston native and America's first born and trained architect, along the vaulted passageways and winding staircases of a building that has witnessed nearly 2 centuries of Charleston history. Tickets for this tour are $5 a person, and you can find more information at the News and Events tab on our website, schistory.org. Before we dive into the episode, I want to remind you that you can view digitized versions of the 4th Regiment's order book on the Lowcountry Digital Library's website. Type 4th Regiment into the search bar on the site there, and you can follow along with their adventures. Let's talk about our sources. For this episode, we used South Carolina's 4th Regiment order book housed at the Historical Society, papers of the Second Council of Safety of the Revolutionary Party in South Carolina, published in the South Carolina Historical and Genealogical Magazine, Reflections of Democracy and Revolutionary South Carolina by Walter J. Fraser, Jr., and Carolina.com. So the last time we talked about these guys, the men of the 4th Regiment, along with the 2nd Regiment and others, had finished setting up camp on Fort Johnson, across the harbor from downtown Charleston, and on the last day we discussed, an American ship leaving the fort was fired on by a British ship. Luckily, without any injuries. But the leader of the fort, Isaac Mott, may have been captured. He oversaw the 3 companies who were occupying the fort at this time. So that's where we'll pick it back up. It's late October, 1775. Let's get into the order book. 20th October, Parole Wilkes, countersign 17. Ordered that all standing orders given by the late Commandant Lieutenant Colonel Mott are to be strictly adhered to and punctually obeyed. Ordered the sentinels of the fort guard not to suffer any soldiers from camp to enter the fort, but on particular business or any other persons. Officers and workmen excepted. So it sounds like Isaac Mott is no longer physically overseeing the fort, but his orders are still to be followed. There's no indication in the order book of where he was, and I haven't been able to find any information elsewhere either. Officers who were captured by either side were often paroled during this time period, a kind of gentleman's agreement. He's not mentioned again in the order book until next month in November, except for the fact that they use his last name as the parole word in the next entry. As a reminder, the parole and countersign words were essentially the passwords to get into the fort, and they often referenced what was happening in that moment. So this could be a nod to the respect that his men had for him, that they used his last name as the parole word of the day. 21st October, Parole Mott, countersign 49. Orders. There be nothing issued by the commanding officer and no notice taken of the Sabbath, I think proper to call my company together and devote this day as much to my God as the business of our discipline would admit. I therefore read them the 9th sermon of the Reverend Mr. Davies, A.M., and concluded with the following prayer. O Lord God of hosts, who hast all the creatures in heaven and in earth to fight thy battles and execute thy pleasures. Thou didst not sow any seeds of enmity in our nature, but didst create man imbued with all the principles of love and dispositions to peace. 'Tis from our lusts and sins that wars and fightings come among us. First we fell out with our God and our own happiness, and ever since it is a quarrelsome, contentious world we live in, where restless men are jostling one another and striving for that ease and content which the world has not for them. This prayer, probably led by Captain Barnard Elliott, goes on for several more pages of the order book, so it's very long, and I don't need to read the whole thing to you, but I thought that the very beginning of that prayer that I just read was interesting because it really addresses the juxtaposition of the idea of religion with what happens in the midst of war or battle. There's another line in a similar vein in the prayer that reads, Preserve us, O our God, from the profaneness and blasphemy, the lewdness and debauchery, the rudeness and violence that are most incident to men of our profession, that we may not be infected with their contagion, but preserve our integrity amidst all the temptations wherewith we are surrounded. Though the sword is in our hands, let the peace of God rule in our hearts, and though we are soldiers, let us not be men delighting in blood and war, but ready servants of our country and faithful instruments for our common defense and safety. I also thought it seemed notable that they took the time to record that entire prayer here in the order book. And if you'd like to read it in its entirety online, look for the October 21st, 1775 entry in the order book, which, again, you can find on the Low Country Digital Library's website. 22nd October, Parole Montgomery, countersign 22. A boat will be ready at 3:30 to carry to Mount Pleasant all the sick men of the detachment and camp that may be fit for the hospital. I haven't been able to find much information about the place that these sick men were taken to, but an entry in the Council of Safety's papers from December of the same year, so just a few months away, gives us an idea of what kinds of illnesses they were being treated for. As a quick reminder, the Council of Safety was a government entity at this time, and the first Council of Safety were the ones who ordered the regiments to capture Fort Johnson initially at the very beginning of this order book. So in December of 1775, their papers from the Council of Safety show that men from the 2nd Regiment were in hospital and being treated for wounds, severe colds, diarrhea, dysentery, fever, and venereal disease. They also show that 4 people were helping to treat the men at the 2nd Regiment Hospital, including a married couple, Sylvester and Margaret Springer, and their son of an unknown age. 25th October, parole winter, countersign Christmas. The carpenters employed to work on the fortifications will be allowed 15 pence per day additional pay and a gill of rum each, provided they perform a good day's work. 2 men of a company to be ready as soon as possible from the detachment in camp as a fatigue party, a careful sergeant to superintend them. When ready, they will receive orders from the commanding officer. At night, the fatigue party will receive a gill of rum per man from the gunner of the fort. 31st October, parole Newcastle, countersign Salmon. Orders from Colonel Moultrie. Ordered that the companies of the 2nd Regiment do hold themselves in readiness to embark for Charlestown as soon as the detachment of Gadsden's shall arrive to relieve them, and that they are to embark in vessels that shall be sent down for them. In consequence of the above order, I immediately proceeded to take an amount and state of the military stores. In the order book following this entry, there is a chart that details out all of the stores, such as the number of cannons, ammunition, powder, that sort of thing. And it sounds like the 2nd Regiment is leaving Fort Johnson on James Island and is heading back to Charleston. The next entry is a long one, and it covers about a month in time. It details their return to the city, but things get a little dangerous upon that return. 1st November, Colonel Mott arrived about noon to take command of the troops ordered for Charlestown, with the detachment to relieve them not arriving till late in the evening. He gave orders to Captain Elliott to take the command and to embark them that evening and land them at Colonel Gadsden's wharf, and march from thence to headquarters, and in the morning very early to send an officer to Colonel Moultrie with the report. Lieutenant Colonel Mott then embarked on board a canoe for Charlestown according to orders. Captain Elliott embarked the men on board the schooner sent down with a detachment of the 1st Regiment, taking on board his own schooner the Harlequin his company of grenadiers, and arrived at Gadsden's wharf about 11 o'clock at night, and landed in half an hour and marched up to the barracks at 12 o'clock, where we now lay quartered. They're back in the city now, but now that they're there, it seems that some of the soldiers are growing a little weary of serving, and they want a bit of a break. An order was issued as the regiment was now together. Every officer should punctually attend at 7 in the morning, as the lieutenant colonel intended exercising the battalion every morning. Accordingly, at 7 the following morning, the battalion was drawn up in the barrack yard, about 250 rank and file, and exercised by Colonel Mott. But the second morning, the number considerably decreased, which, being observed by Colonel Moultrie, Captain Elliott offered to produce the men if the colonel would permit him to search the barracks accordingly. He turned from the different rooms rightly men who were all pretendedly sick, lame, or without arms. Amongst them were several sergeants, whose men Captain Elliott drew up in a line entire, and ordering them according to their companies. The doctor was sent for, and such as he found sick were ordered to the hospital, and the remaining 72 were found to be impostors. Their captains were sent for by the colonel from the battalion and reprimanded for their neglect. The day following, an express being received that the Tories in the remote parts of the province having defeated our militia commanded by Major Williamson, and a detachment of the provincial troops under the command of Major Mason, and intended marching to Dorchester to take possession of our powder magazine there. This incident they're learning about involved the Loyalist commander Patrick Cunningham. He and his men first seized a wagon full of gunpowder near the modern location of Casey, which is just outside of Columbia, and that gunpowder was being sent to the 96th District in the upstate of South Carolina to the Cherokee Native Americans there to show the Americans friendship. It was ordered by Henry Lawrence and the Council of Safety to be sent up that way. Cunningham's men also captured a portion of the 3rd Regiment of Rangers during that seizure of the wagon. A few days later, Cunningham captured another wagon of gunpowder, and there was talk of him gathering men to help free his brother, who was in prison in Charleston on charges of sedition, which, as a little history reminder for you, sedition is an act, like speech, meant to organize an overthrow of a lawful authority. So I would imagine that word of these incidents would have changed the tune a little bit of the men who were pretending to be sick. A detachment was ordered under the command of Captain Marion to proceed immediately for that place, Dorchester. Accordingly, his light infantry marched off that evening. The day following, Lieutenant Colonel Mott neglected the exercising of the battalion. The Congress setting on matters of the highest moment required the early and constant attendance of its members, amongst which were several of our officers. So right there, basically, they're saying that a lot of the officers were actually involved in Congress too, and that took precedence. So they had to book it to meet with the other leaders of the state instead of exercising the battalion. This and other matters put a stop to the battalion exercise. About 4:30 a heavy cannonade alarmed us at the barracks in the morning. The whole regiment then there stood to their arms, and Captain Elliott waited for orders from Colonel Moultrie, having sent a sergeant for orders on this occasion. No field officer being at quarters, the sergeant soon returned and acquainted us the colonel would be with us immediately, that the Tamar man of war was firing upon the schooner Defense, which, being commanded by Captain Tufts, was employed in sinking holes in Hog Island Creek. Let's pause there so we can orient ourselves geographically about what's happening right now. This incident that they're talking about happened over 2 days on November 11th and 12th, so that's where we are in the timeline now. Hog Island Creek was a channel between Hog Island, which sat in the Charleston harbor, and the larger area of Mount Pleasant. The Tamar man of war was a British ship that was firing on an American ship, a schooner, called the Defense. To prevent the man of war coming up through that channel, they had sunk 3 hulks and was about to sink a 4th when, from the Tamar's warping up and the fire being too heavy for a small schooner whose guns being 4-pounders would avail nothing against the Tamar's guns, Captain Tufts prudently was towing up his schooner. During this, a small boat was sent off from the Cherokee man of war, and fire was put to the 4th hulk in this cannonade. Okay, so Captain Simon Tufts, who was commanding the USS Defense, was leading men to sink several ship holes in this Hog Island channel to block it up so that the British couldn't use it to get into the Charleston harbor. They would instead have to pass by Fort Johnson, which had cannons that it could use on these British ships. In the middle of this task of sinking these holes to block up this channel, the USS Defense was attacked by the British in the Tamar, a type of ship called a man of war. And then another British man of war, the Cherokee, joined in. But the Americans were about to get lucky. The 130 cannon was fired by broadsides from the Tamar and the Cherokee, but 3 shots struck the Defense, one between wind and water in her side, another in her counter, and a third near the fore tophead. 3 cannon were fired from Fort Johnson, 2 of which were said to go through the spritsail and mizzen of the Tamar and to drop far beyond them, which no doubt has occasioned their laying with more uneasiness than before. The distance that Johnson's cannons would reach was unknown to them. The USS Defense survived, and with perhaps less damage than the British. And my apologies on those sailing terms there. I hope I pronounced them right. It's after this that the powers that be get serious, because on November 13th, 1775, the 4th Regiment was officially authorized for service as part of the South Carolina Provincial Troops. And you can tell in the order book that things get more official. The day following, in the afternoon, Captain Elliott exercised the battalion by the beat of drum, which was much approved of by all the officers present. The necessity of an artillery regiment being immediately raised was, at this time, the opinion of Congress, as our cannon was improperly attended to, and officers qualified for that purpose was thought of accordingly. Major Roberts of the 1st Regiment was voted Lieutenant Colonel Commandant, and Captain Elliott of the Grenadiers of the 2nd Regiment voted Major of Artillery. The regiment to consist of 3 companies of 100 men each. The order book then goes on to name all of the people assigned to the roles within those companies, which is a little boring to listen to, so we'll skip ahead to where these men are going next. Orders were immediately issued by the Colonel Commandant that all the officers should set out recruiting, except Captain Beekman, Lieutenant Detreville, and Brooke Roberts, who were ordered to Fort Johnson and at Beale's Battery. In a few days after the provincial field officers and militia officers were summoned by the order of our Council of Safety and a plan of defense agreed on, Lieutenant Colonel Commandant Roberts of Artillery to command the batteries on the south and Major Elliott to command the north battery. The Charlestown militia to be drawn up in Broad Street, and the country militia in Meeting Street. The provincial infantry of the 1st Regiment to man the batteries, assisted by a few recruits of the artillery. As a reminder, too, the 4th Regiment that we've been talking about, it's an artillery regiment. We talked a little bit about this in the last order book episode, but they were basically in charge of the weaponry and the batteries that were being built all over Charleston. So the order book then goes on to again detail all the new assignments for the men, and then it talks about what the regiments need. The stores on Gadsden's Wharf were recommended by Major Elliott and Captain Beekman to the Congress as the most proper for artillery barracks, and were, by order of Congress, ordered to be fitted up for that purpose with all expedition. And Lieutenant Colonel Commandant Roberts, being relieved by Captain Beekman from Fort Johnson, came up to join his regiment. He then, for the first time, ordered that the quartermaster should proceed to Georgia and there purchase necessary clothing for the regiment. And thus ends a long November entry, which spilled into December. The troops are official now, they're getting legit uniforms, and attacks around South Carolina seem to be coming more frequently, so it's just in time. 18th December. And on the 18th day of December 1775 issued the following order: that all the non-commissioned officers and matrosses of the South Carolina Regiment of Artillery do sleep this night and henceforth constantly reside at their barracks on Colonel Gadsden's Wharf under the immediate care and command of Lieutenant James Mitchell until further orders. A commissioned officer of each company to attend roll call every day at 9 in the morning and 5 in the evening, at which time no man must presume to absent himself on pain of the highest displeasure. Drunkenness will at all times be punished with severity. A morning report to be made daily to the commanding officer of the regiment at quarters at 10 o'clock. Additional orders. The men are to be divided into messes of 6. The quartermaster will deliver a pan and kettle to each mess. The sergeants and corporals to mess by themselves. In cases of alarm, Captain Beekman's company must attend at the South Bastion, Captain White at the battery on Beale's Wharf, and Captain Drayton on Colonel Gadsden's till further orders. So a quick note there, if you're not super familiar with military, mess means to eat. So they were just explaining there how the men of the company would eat. One thing to note here is that the men of the 4th Regiment now have a new leader. While not mentioned in the order book, Colonel Isaac Mott actually gets sent back to Fort Johnson to command the new batch of troops there in building up the fort, and the 4th Regiment is now commanded by Lieutenant James Mitchell in Charleston proper, in downtown Charleston. They are barracked at Gadsden's Wharf. And as a reminder, that's where the International African American Museum now stands today. So now we've got a few entries here that get back into daily life for the men of the regiment. 22nd December, General Orders. That a pay bill of each company be immediately made out to Monday next, and the private ration money be added to their pay from the day of their enlistment, the 18th instant inclusive. The bills to be given in to the paymaster by 3 o'clock this afternoon at farthest. Regiment Orders, 25th December. It's expected the commission, as well as non-commissioned officers of the artillery, will take particular care that the privates of their respective companies appropriate part of their pay the purchasing of necessaries, particularly shoes and stockings. And I think this is just a funny little note here that it's Christmas Day, December 25th, and they are celebrating this holiday by reminding the privates, the soldiers on kind of the lowest level here, that they need to make sure and save some of their pay to be able to purchase the necessaries like shoes and stockings. Regimental Orders, 29th December, 1775, Parole, Norway. All officers and privates of the artillery are daily to practice the long gun from the hours of 10 to 12 in the morning under the direction of Major Elliott until further orders. Regimental Orders, 1st January, 1776, Parole, Somerset. Ordered that a sentinel from the South Carolina Regiment of Artillery be placed on the platform of Colonel Lawrence's Wharf day and night and be relieved every 2 hours, every company to take it in rotation. Lieutenant James Mitchell is to relieve Captain Beekman and take the command of the battery at Hadrill's Point until further orders. So the leader, the new-ish leader of the 4th Regiment, has just been sent to the battery at Hadrill's Point until further orders, and that is across the Cooper River from downtown Charleston. And it's now 1776. That was the entry for January 1st, so that's where we're going to leave it for this episode. As you may be aware, so much is about to happen in 1776 for the American colonies, and Charleston will be a big part of that, including a victory in June that is still celebrated here today. We'll see you next month with a new episode, but in the meantime, you can visit our museum in the Fireproof Building at 100 Meeting Street in Charleston, or our archives on the 3rd floor of the College of Charleston's Addlestone Library. You can also visit our website at schistory.org and follow us on Facebook and Instagram. Thanks for joining us.